For people of a certain age, Britain was never cooler than in the 1990s. That will come as debatable to some, those partial to the 1960s British invasion era, to be sure. But writer Dylan Jones lays out a pretty wide ranging case for the 90s in his new book. It's called Faster Than a Cannonball 1995 and All That. He spent those years as a working journalist and columnist at GQ, The Guardian, and The Sunday Times, to name just a few. And Dylan Jones joins us now on the line from London, UK. Hi, Dylan.
How you doing?
Really nice to connect with you. We are a nerdy show, so we get very impressed with research, and the research in this book is phenomenal. You spoke with 169 people, everyone from Boris Johnson, David Beckham, Steve McQueen, my favorite Spice Girl Mel B, Tony Blair, and Yoko Ono. Why did you want to document this era of cool Britannia as an oral history?
Well, I've made a virtue of oral histories, and I like the oral history as a form because it creates drama, it creates tension, because no two people's recollection of one event are ever the same. They might be similar, but they're always different, and that adds light and shade to a particular period. And it also adds a lot of insight, I think, because people's takeaway from a particular event, like I say, always has variations.
Well, you did get perspectives from the political world, the world of media, musicians, artists, and we're going to talk a little bit about those different disciplines. But if you're a fan of Oasis, you might catch the meaning of the title, Faster Than a Cannonball. What is it a reference to?
It's a reference to a song on their second album, What's the Story, Morning Glory, which was not just the biggest album of 1995 in the UK, but pretty much the biggest album culturally of the decade.
Why was 1995 especially a memorable year in Britain?
I think that most periods in pop culture, they tend to kind of reach their peak mid-decade, and that was certainly true in the 90s. It was the year where Britpop really took hold. It was the year that probably had the greatest amount of music in the 90s. And even though it was 2 years before the general election, politically there was a lot going on. Culturally there was a lot going on. It just felt like the best and most interesting year of the decade, and also a really good year to look through as a prism for the rest of the period.
And I'm guessing too, going back to the title of the book, Oasis was one of the biggest bands in the world, probably the biggest band in the UK. Is that another reason why you named the book Faster Than a Cannonball?
Yeah, I think it has a very, it immediately semaphores what the period is about, and it immediately takes people back to that period. So there's high recognition factor.
You know, I mentioned at the very beginning that the 90s, specifically 1995, was a big year for some people. But I guess when you think of Britain, for some people, the swinging era was, defined by the 1960s. So what did the Britain of the 1990s have in common with the swinging 60s?
I think a lot of cultural critics look at the 90s as some kind of echo of the 60s. And that's certainly true, both in terms of style and exuberance and entrepreneurship. But I actually think that the 90s culturally is as important as the 60s. I think that it's easy to look back at the 90s and take some of the tropes and some of the big cultural issues like Trainspotting or the Spice Girls or Oasis or Britpop, and come away with a very clear idea of what that decade meant. But it was an incredibly varied decade. There was a lot going on. And also there was a huge upsurge in working class culture. And I think if you look at the art world, the music world, even the political world, I think there was a force there that hasn't been seen since in this country.
Well, you mentioned the working class, and I want to read you part of What Noel Gallagher of Oasis said to you in the book about British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's influence on his generation. And viewer discretion, there are a few curse words in this quote, so I'll try to keep it as clean as I can. Um, Noel Gallagher says, no one will ever admit it, but we were all Thatcher's children who got off our arses and did it for ourselves. What I mean is that this all happened in spite of Thatcherism. We were all on the dole, all on benefits, and it must have dawned on us all that we were not going to get anything and that nothing would be given to us. So we had better go and effing find a way of taking it. To me, the 90s was a lot of working class intellectuals who were not really connected, who all came through at the same time in politics, music, fashion, photography, art, sport. So if these artists from across many disciplines weren't connected, as he points out, then how were they able to become so successful?
I think because there was a very hungry and rapacious media. I think a lot of media at the time was run by people who had come out of similar situations. A lot of people like myself had spent the 80s working in style magazines, and by the time of the 90s, we were working in newspapers and were perhaps in greater positions of power. Plus, like I said, there was an incredible groundswell, whether you were in the art world, in publishing, in music, in film, and plus there was a big nightclub culture at the time. And I think you always have to remember that this was a decade without social media. This is the last analog decade where people didn't rely upon social media to propel themselves, and so consequently had to form their own communities, real communities.
You do have a quote in the book. Noel Gallagher says that. Do you think because there wasn't the internet, there wasn't this like immediate feedback loop, that maybe this allowed these artists across all disciplines a greater sense of freedom and creativity?
I think that I think these days you probably have more creativity, but I think I return to my use of the word community. Community is very powerful, and when your community is digital, it's quite diffuse, and it's different. It's difficult to harness that power. You might be able to harness the power fleetingly, but it dissipates and disappears quite quickly. And I think one of the most important things about the 90s was that creation of community and communities.
Who were the YBAs, speaking of community?
The YBAs were the young British artists, people like Damien Hirst, Mark Quinn, Tracy Emin, Sue Webster. These were people, again, who came out of a largely working class culture, who were antagonistic towards the art establishment and established themselves quite quickly as enfants terribles, really smashing against the system, and in the process created an awful lot of media fuss about themselves. But the most important thing about the YBAs, along with the most important factor of all the young British groups at the time, is that these people were genuinely talented.
Mm. Well, I'm glad you said that because in the book, you have quotes from David Bowie, and David Bowie was a huge fan of Damien Hirst. What would you say was the appeal of these young artists?
The appeal was that they were all genuinely talented. They all had a huge amount of disrespect for the art establishment, and they were prepared to do something about it. And they sort of mobilized en masse. And so you had a genuine scene. It wasn't something that was manufactured by the media. And it had inherent worth and inherent quality. They were very, very good and still are.
Well, let's move on and talk about music because you do cover a number of subjects in the book. Here's a picture I want to show you of Select Magazine from 1993 featuring Brett Anderson from the band swayed in front of a Union Jack. Would you say that this was the beginning of Britpop?
Yeah, it was. And I think that it's very easy to look back now through a particular lens and think that any use of the Union Jack is associated with Brexit, is associated with nationalism, etc. But actually, it's a very powerful British trope. It's a very powerful cultural trope. Was used a lot in the 60s by pop artists like Peter Blake and pop groups like The Who. And it did become very associated with Britpop, which is why I think a lot of artists involved in Britpop look slightly defensively at that period, because I think they think that it somehow infers that they are being more overly patriotic. But it was used principally as a cultural thematic trope, as a backdrop to all this fantastic rebellion.
Well, because I keep thinking of like the Spice Girls, and they were wearing, I can't remember which Spice Girl, but they had a skirt of the British Union Jack. Is
Yeah.
that, how was that received?
Well, at the time, it was received very playfully because the Spice Girls were a very playful entity. But I think it's possible now to look back and think that it's a bit naff in the way that Austin Powers is a bit naff. But it was a very powerful statement at the time because it was emblematic of the country, and it said, the British are coming, watch out.
Well, the two biggest bands associated with Britpop were arguably Oasis and Blur. How influential were they?
They were enormously influential, even though they were very different entities. Blur were a southern art school band, and Oasis were a northern working class band. And it was the kind of mixture of football culture and art school culture. And that fantastic clash was really what the decade was about.
So that clash, is that why they hated each other, or was this something that was kind of manufactured by the media and the fans?
Well, there was a mutual dislike because it was the working class against the middle class largely. But it was manipulated by the media, but it was manipulated by the music press. So it wasn't as though it was manipulated by the national press, but this helped those groups achieve notoriety. It helped those groups achieve popularity. And in the grand scheme of things, was a very effective mechanism.
We have a picture here from one of the prominent British magazines at the time, NME, and you've got on one side Blur versus Oasis on the other side. When you say it was an effective mechanism, was it an effective mechanism to sell magazines and the music?
Correct.
Can you?
which I have never thought was a bad thing about pop music, because pop music was created to be popular.
We can't talk about music in Britain without talking about the Beatles. And in the book, you write about the reemergence of the Beatles after an anthology of their work was released in 1995. What influence did they have on British musicians of that decade, of the 90s decade?
Huge. And I think it's easy to forget that before the 90s, the Beatles had gone through a period of about 15 or 20 years when they weren't actually fashionable. I mean, now the Beatles are probably still the coolest band in the world and have been for the last 25, 30 years. But there was a period from 1970 when they broke up to the mid-90s when the Beatles weren't really cool at all. A lot of them made quite naff solo albums. They disappeared from public view. There was the tragic death of John Lennon. So I think there was a period where people didn't really culturally reconnect with the Beatles. But that certainly happened in the 90s because a lot of Britpop bands revered the Beatles. And ever since then, there's been a new Beatles product every couple of years, from the anthology to Get Back to all of these wonderful recreations of the 60s.
Well, it's interesting to hear that, and it was also really interesting to read that at some point Paul McCartney was embarrassed to be associated with the Beatles because in North America, I think the Beatles have always been one of the greatest bands. But you spoke with Yoko Ono, John Lennon's widow and an artist in her own right, and you interviewed her in the home she shared with him. How would you describe your time with her?
It was kind of like being with a very holy person. I think that it's very easy, or had been easy, to disparage Yoko Ono as a bit of a freak and as someone who had contributed to the downfall creatively of John Lennon, but actually being in her presence and also being in the apartment where they used to live was an incredibly humbling experience. And I found meeting her completely exhilarating
Why?
because of the lives that she had touched and the lives that had touched her, but also the way in which she talked about their relationship and the way that she talked about John's talent. And I felt it was a very precious thing.
The 90s also saw the rise of Tony Blair and the New Labour Party. How did he intersect with the Britpop scene?
Well, even though most of the interesting music and the cultural signifiers at the time happened before Tony Blair actually entered office in 1997 when he won the general election. Before that, Tony Blair and the Labour Party had co-opted the creative community, and they weren't simply doing this to be expedient. They understood that creativity was a vital life force for the country, and also that the creative classes tended to be younger, more liberal, more left wing, and they wanted to support them because if you read the book, and it doesn't matter which chapter you read, whether you read about sport or media or music or art, politics, whatever, you will find that there's a general feeling that, as Noel Gallagher was quoted earlier, that there was a lot of these movements happened in spite of Thatcherism rather than because of it.
Well, it's interesting because David Bowie, you talked about why it was good for the politicians to be part of this scene. It helped them get the votes. It helped, I guess, up their cool factor with the younger voters. But I'm interested to see, like, what did the artists get out of it themselves? Because you talked about the YBAs being anti-establishment, but David Bowie was even presented with an award from Tony Blair at one point. What did these artists get from their association with someone like Tony Blair?
Well, I think that any artist who gets into bed metaphorically with a politician regrets it. And that's because most political careers end in failure. And I think that you can look at that famous photograph of Noel Gallagher shaking hands with Tony Blair at Downing Street in 1997, which was a gift for Tony Blair because it semaphored the fact that he had somehow made a connection with the creative community. But if you speak to Noel Gallagher now, he will think that's a mistake because the only people it really benefited were the Labour Party. It didn't really benefit Oasis. I think they were just flattered. And I think people are flattered initially by political attention and then tend to regret it in later life.
Well, you know, with years comes wisdom, I guess you could say that. But when would you say Britpop ended?
Well, it started to end after 1995, and I think that there was a general ascent to the mid-decade and then a general descent. However, I think it's very easy to look at this period and think that Britpop took over the world. Didn't really. It took over the UK. And one of the few bands to actually break out from the UK actually happened after 95, more like 96, 97, 98, which was the Spice Girls, which we were talking about earlier. And the Spice Girls were a genuine phenomenon. And actually, they became the biggest British export of the 90s, bigger than Oasis, bigger than Blur, bigger than Pulp, bigger than all of them.
What do you think it was the appeal of the Spice Girls to, I guess, break that barrier?
I think it was the fact that they were the girl band, and previously girl bands hadn't really happened. It was the fact that they made great pop music. They all had great personalities. They were exuberant. They were a bit cocky, a bit cheeky, and they were fun.
You said great personalities. They were also cute. I can say that, I guess.
You can, I can't. I'm not allowed to say things like that anymore. No one is.
I want to quote the filmmaker Steve McQueen, who you also interviewed in the book. He had this to say about Britpop. He says, Britpop for me was about whiteness. It wasn't at all about possibilities or fusions. It was all about the past, nostalgia. The needle had stuck and people didn't want to go forward. Things were changing all around, like house, hip hop, and jungle. Obviously, they were afraid of the future and wanted to hold on to a past. One only has to quote Noel Gallagher, I'm not having hip hop at Glastonbury. It's wrong. We know that Jay-Z eventually responded by singing his own version of Wonderwall at Glastonbury in 2008. Was Britpop about the past and nostalgia?
I think there were elements of it which had echoes of the 60s, both musically and stylistically. But I think as Steve said in that quote, and he was a fantastic person to interview for the book, there was so much other kind of music that was coming out of Britain at the time: hip hop, trip hop, jungle, the remnants of the acid house days. So the 90s were very helpful as a platform for a lot of club music, for a lot of dance music, for a lot of black music, and it created for a very rich musical environment.
Dylan, do you know what I just realized? I just realized that the 90s was 30 years ago now. um,
I know, it's crazy, right?
It goes by so fast. Looking back, how would you say the 90s influenced the Britain of today?
Well, I think we look back upon the 90s now, perhaps in the way in the 90s that we look back upon the 60s. We look upon the 90s as a kind of halcyon period, and it was the last decade of the last century. And I think there was a sense of fiddling while Rome burned, a lot of exuberance, a lot of drug taking, and a kind of existential fear that perhaps as we ticked-tocked towards the end of the decade, that somehow this was going to be it. At the time in this country, we were all worried about something called the millennium bug, which had been driven by the media, which was this idea that as soon as we reached midnight at the end of 1999, that all the computers were going to stop, all the trains were going to stop, all the electricity was going to be turned off, and it was going to be apocalyptic. Weirdly, it didn't happen.
You've worked in this business for a very long time. You are a member of the media, but you've had the opportunity to speak to so many people across so many disciplines. What do you hope this book does for that period of time in the history of music in Britain?
I hope that it elevates it and encourages people to treat it with some respect, because one of the reasons I wrote the book is because there have been, you have to have a certain amount of arrogance to do something like this, and there are so many rubbish TV programs about the 90s that I kind of wanted to rescue it from the cultural dustbin.
Well, I hope you don't cancel me with this last question, but if you could settle the debate for us once and for all, who was better, Oasis or Blur?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I'm going to say Blur very quickly, but then I'm going to go like that.
Well, that's the end of the interview. Dylan, thank you so much. Congratulations. I don't even know how you did this. Phenomenal. Congratulations. Great job.
Thank you. Great to talk to you. Cheerio.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.